actually thinking about how to approach this talk. We completely redid it last night because there have been so many ideas that have come up in the last 2 days that are related to what I think we have to share, and trying to organize it in a meaningful way is a little bit challenging. But I have to say, one of the things that really resonated with me from Lee Shulman's talk was his point that early thinking about PCK didn't pay enough attention to student learning. And that has been really central to our thinking about PCK. And so we think PCK has to be good for something. So I'm going to just sort of tell you kind of where we're coming from, show you off that. We think that there is both correct and incorrect PCK. And that correctness is judged by whether or not that PCK helps students learn. And this could be judged in a couple of different ways. If there's been research on the learning of a specific topic, is the PCK consistent with that research? Okay. And if there isn't research on that specific topic, which is true for a lot of topics in science, is the PCK consistent with what we know about how people learn and consistent with the actual content? Okay. So these are two frames that we use to think about what are plausible hypotheses about what is correct PCK. And I think it's also important to talk about what we mean by learning. Okay? We don't mean rote memorization or being able to plug and chug through equations. We take learning to mean deep conceptual understanding, both of important science ideas, but also of the evidentiary-based nature of science as a way of knowing. Okay? And we see confluences between how people learn and the way scientific knowledge is developed, and think this plays nicely into sort of a theory for instruction. So this leads us into our thought of canonical PCK. Okay? That canonical PCK is widely agreed upon PCK that's formed either through research or through expert wisdom of practice. Okay? And that personal PCK is more idiosyncratic, and that is shaped by context, and is formed through preparing to teach, the act of teaching, and reflecting on teaching. Okay? Personal PCK may be related to the canon, maybe an adaptation of something that's in the canon, or it may not be. So we kind of developed a graphical model, but I'm just going to slide through. So just to give you an example of what we mean. So we know in physics that students struggle with the idea of an object of motion will continue moving if there's no net force acting on it. Okay? Most learners think that if an object's moving, it'll slow down and stop on its own. So from the physics education research, we know that if you introduce the idea of friction as a force and allow students opportunities to examine motion with different amounts of friction, this can help them overcome this cognitive conflict and adapt this scientific model of motion. Okay? So an example of personal PCK that's related to this idea is if a teacher knows his or her students are really into ice hockey, okay, and they play hockey in the local league, instead of just doing some experiments in the classroom based upon like different types of sandpaper, what I did when I was a teacher. The teacher might have the students compare the motion of a hockey puck sliding across a table versus sliding across the ice at the ice rink, and use that to help them make a connection to their life and overcome, you know, this misconception that we know students have. Okay. So canonical PCK may become part of someone's personal PCK, may be adapted, may be influenced by context. Okay. Personal PCK can become collective knowledge, and it may eventually become part of the canon. Though I think we would sort of footnote that and say not all collective knowledge becomes canonical. That teachers may agree on something that doesn't really help student learning. In that case, it wouldn't become part of the canon. Okay. So to kind of flesh out our visual display here, we have the canonical PCK, which is informed by research on student learning and instructional practices, and the personal PCK, which is informed by personal experience. We think that canonical PCK in the act of teaching shapes personal PCK, and that personal PCK can kind of, through the consensus of many teachers or through research, become part of the canon. Just like a simple graphical to represent it. So I want to tell you briefly about a study that we did last year that's related to this. But I need to give you a little bit of history first. Several years ago, we had a project where we tried to work with 3 groups of teachers in different content areas to both deepen their content knowledge and deepen their understanding of how students learn that content area. Okay. And what we found, even though we couldn't measure PCK, is that we had an impact on teachers' disciplinary content knowledge. Okay? And they seem to buy into this idea of using evidence to teach science content. Okay? But we didn't really see much impact in their classroom. Okay? And in thinking about this, well, you know what? PCK isn't the only thing that goes into teacher decision making. Okay? There are lots of factors that affect what goes on in the classroom. And we started wondering, well, what can we do to sort of test this connection a little bit better? And we thought, well, you know, one of the main drivers of what teachers do are the instructional materials they have available to them. And if their instructional materials don't support teaching for learning, it's asking an awful lot of the teacher to do that on his or her own. So we decided to do a little study where we created a replacement unit in physics on force and motion for 5th grade students. Okay, it was a 9-week unit. And this set of instructional materials were explicitly designed to align with what we know from how people learn, to take advantage of the canonical PCK in force and motion, and then also to introduce this idea of educative supports for teachers, providing surrounding materials for the teachers to help them implement the unit purposely. Okay. And we wanted to see what would happen if we gave the teachers these materials. So we also provided some professional development for the teachers around these materials. We didn't think it would be fair to say, here you go, have fun. We know in America, especially elementary teachers struggle with science, especially the physical sciences tend to be one of the areas they profess themselves to be weak in, and often have a fear of physics. So we had 6 days of professional development, focused mostly on deepening the teacher's content knowledge, through the use of the instructional activities that we were hoping they would use in their classroom. Okay? This also gave them the opportunity to become familiar with the mechanics of implementing those materials. But we had 2 other main strands of the professional development as well. One, we thought it was important for the teachers to not just learn the ideas in isolation, but to develop a larger conceptual framework for the ideas and see how the ideas sort of in a developmental progression fit together and related to other ideas they were supposed to teach. So we spent some time in the workshop talking about the progression of ideas. Okay. We also spent some time trying to actually work explicitly at deepening their PCK. And we did this through several approaches. One was having them first reflect on their own learning, sort of being metacognitive about what they were experiencing and how that helped them learn the content. Okay. We then had them, a little bit later on in the workshop, reflect on what the facilitator was doing to help them learn the content. Try to start getting explicit about what the instructional moves were. Okay. We spent some time talking about the pedagogical model and how people learn. And then one of the most powerful things we did is we actually did a fishbowl interview where I sat down and interviewed the PD provider who was working with the content stuff and asked him questions about why specifically he was doing what he was doing. And gave him an opportunity to be really explicit about what he knew about how people learn the content and where people struggle. And that just turned out to be a really powerful experience for the teachers, and that was one of the things that they commented on. So what did we collect? We had teacher content knowledge assessments. We had the teachers administer pre and post assessments to their students in their classroom before and after they taught their unit on force and motion. So what did we find? Well, we did a lot of classroom observations during this study, and even with the professional development and the materials, we found that there was a huge range of implementation, both in the extent to which teachers chose to use the instructional materials. We didn't force them to do it. Some teachers did the whole unit. Some teachers pick and chose lessons. Okay. There was also variation in the extent to which teachers adopted the pedagogical approach. Some teachers either didn't believe in the approach or struggled with the implementation of it. It requires, I think, different classroom management skills than more didactic teaching approaches do. And some teachers really just dove in and were able to implement it pretty with a high degree of fidelity. We also provide some these educative supports to help them do this, and there were 3 main components to the supports. One was it made very explicit for each lesson what the targeted learning idea was. We wanted to reduce the probability that teachers would do these activities as activities for activity's sake. Fun, engaging stuff, but without the learning goal in mind. We also included a summary of research on student thinking related to that targeted idea. And then, I think really critically, is we described how that particular activity provided evidence to reach the targeted idea and to confront the misconceptions. Okay. So, student assessment data. we had a comparison group of teachers who didn't go to the PD and didn't have the materials. And we found that across their 9-week unit, their students learned about or gained about 9 points on our assessment. Okay? On average, the teachers in our treatment group gained 16 points. Their students gained 16 points. It was a statistically significant effect size of like 0.36, I think. Now, we also found that in the treatment group, teachers that only used a small proportion of the lessons, their kids didn't do any better than the comparison group. So the actual materials seemed to make a big difference. Okay? And that when teachers implemented the pedagogy with high fidelity, their students had even larger gains than the typical treatment teacher. Interestingly, teachers' disciplinary content knowledge scores did not seem to be related to student learning needs. We're not sure how to explain that. Okay. So implications, we believe that the study supports the idea that canonical PCK can be embedded in instructional materials and that this is a scalable approach for improving science instruction on a large scale. Just kind of redundant. So a couple of questions for us to think about as a group. What are the implications of the canonical personal PCK distinction for our collective work? And then if someone reads and uses canonical PCK, does it automatically become personal PCK, or is there some sort of other transformation that has to take place? We don't know.